Inside courtroom 7, the prosecution and defense making their final cases to jurors in the Aaron Hernandez murder trial. The former NFL star's defense team arguing the case against Hernandez is not a mystery show, asking jurors, where is the proof? With closing arguments now complete, the jury is expected to begin their deliberations later today. Right now, we see Judge Garsh giving her instructions to those jurors. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Costello in New York. The fate of Aaron Hernandez will soon lie in the jury's hands as they decide whether Hernandez murdered semi-pro football player Odin Lloyd back in 2013. Now, the defense has tried to show Lloyd was murdered by one of Hernandez's friends, one of two men that the prosecution is calling alleged accomplices, while possibly being stoned on PCP, not the former Patriots star player. Following this story for us and this trial from Boston, former prosecutor and professor at New England Law, Wendy Murphy. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us.
Prosecutors,
thank you. Prosecutors took months to present their case, questioning 131 witnesses. The defense, however, wrapped in less than a day. Why so fast?
Well, my opinion is that they didn't have much to offer. The fact that it took this long can be an advantage for the defense. The longer a trial takes, the more blurry things get. The tougher it seems sometimes for jurors to put pieces together because something happened a month ago and then another piece happens more recently, and how do they go together? I mean, the closing argument really is key because the prosecutor then has to remind the jurors of lots of things that they heard a long, long time ago. In that sense, the fact that the case stretched out as much as it did could be seen as something that would work to the advantage of the defense. On the other hand, they didn't stretch it out at all at their end. I mean, with only 3 witnesses, they really didn't have very much to say. The only inference I can draw, because I would have tried to call lots of witnesses if I could have, continuing that idea that dragging it out is good for the defense, the fact that they only called 3 witnesses suggests to me that they didn't have anything else to offer, and that they feel like the job they did on cross-examination of those 131 witnesses was good enough to poke at least some holes in some of the evidence.
And perhaps a confidence in the fact that the prosecution, in their opinion, didn't do their job, didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt?
I can't agree with that, even though that is sometimes the case. That degree of confidence can be implied in the fact that the defense, rather than putting on any case at all, sometimes will stand up and say, we call no witnesses. We're so confident, we don't need to call anybody. I can't see that here. In fact, the case really is extraordinarily strong. And I say that for a lot of reasons, including that we literally have videotape of everything but the crime scene. Mm-hmm. And then at the crime scene, we have unassailable forensic proof that only 3 guys were there, which means in the world of potential killers, there are only 3 choices. And this guy is being prosecuted not as the only killer, but as one of 3 killers who worked together. In other words, the prosecutor doesn't even have to prove that it was Hernandez who pulled the trigger to win. And because there really is no doubt that it was one of these 3 guys, and they're on videotape before and after the crime, I mean, a juror's going to have to work really hard to downgrade the evidence in this case to the point where they're going to say, we think Hernandez was just an unwitting dupe who just happened upon the scene, had no idea what was going on, and these other guys, killed him, and Hernandez knew nothing about it. Remember, much of what Hernandez did and his fiancée did after the crime suggests a consciousness of guilt, from covering up and destroying evidence to lying. I think the key witness in this case was Bob Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, who testified for the prosecution that he liked Hernandez, that he hugged and kissed the guy when he confronted him about these allegations. But he said Hernandez lied to him. He said Hernandez could prove that he wasn't there and that he didn't do it. And that turned out to be false. He said he was going to be seen on videotape at a club at the time of the crime. And he said that at a time when nobody was aware of the time of the crime.
Right.
Why is Bob Kraft such a key witness? Because he said he likes the guy. What's the defense going to do with a witness like that? Right. You can't call Bob Kraft.
Let me ask you this, Wendy. Let me ask you this.
Guy.
You're saying the case is so strong, but the prosecution never presented a possible motive, no eyewitnesses here, and no murder weapon. That to some people sounds like a big problem in the prosecution's case. Yet you're saying it's really strong.
But it's only a problem, Carol, if you have to prove where the murder weapon is, or if you have to prove that a particular murder weapon was used, and you don't. It's a problem when you can't prove motive if you're required to prove motive, which you're not required to prove. And frankly, who cares whether they have the weapon or not when we know, because it's not disputed, that Hernandez owned a Glock, and a Glock was the murder weapon. No one disputes those things, nor can they be disputed. So the fact that there's no Glock to be found really, if anything, hurts the defense, because if this was a guy who owned a Glock and it was in his house and it was only gone after the crime, the jury can only infer that he got rid of it because, that's right, he knew it was the murder weapon.
Right.
The fact that there's no weapon to be found really helps the prosecution.
Well, speaking about this gun, let's talk about that home surveillance footage. Prosecutors saying it shows Hernandez holding a gun, or the Glock, the same kind of gun, of course, used to kill Lloyd. But the defense lawyers say it was something completely different. How do you feel about what they're saying was in that video, and does it all really matter?
Well, you know, everyone can use their own opinion about what they think was in the video. It was grainy, and if you're not familiar with guns, you might say, doesn't look like a gun to me. I mean, it sort of has the shape of a gun, but I don't know. Maybe it's something else, or maybe it's a toy gun. Proving that what was in that grainy video in Hernandez's hand was a Glock or the murder weapon really wasn't the point. The point was to show that something that looked like a gun was in his hand at the time of the crime. And in order not to get sort of taken by that, the defense had to come up with an alternative explanation. Well, what could it have been? If it wasn't a gun, what was it? And the only thing they came up with was, which I have to say, this was one of those moments when I laughed, when I read the story about what they said. Couldn't it have been a clicker, a television clicker? No, because why would Hernandez be walking around with a clicker in his hand at that moment in time? It was so absurd. But there was no other explanation. And again, so you come back to, well, it wasn't clearly a Glock, but it also wasn't remotely anything else.
And you think that this would make the jurors mistrust then the defense team for them to say something that, you know, in your opinion is so ludicrous that it was a remote control?
Well, I'm not sure if it goes to trust, but it might make the jurors think, boy, are they desperate that they know there's no way to get over this evidence or to weaken it or to poke holes in it. And so because they had to come up with something, they offer us the idea of this being a television clicker when even we, the jury, can look at it and say, I'm no gun expert, but that ain't no clicker. And, you know, that just, it's not that it makes them not trust the defense. It's that they're going to think the defense has no case because they wouldn't prop up such an absurd explanation if they had a better one.
Got you. And last week, let's talk about this. We saw Hernandez's fiance, Shania Jenkins, take the stand. She was given immunity for her testimony, but was that testimony believable, and does it really carry any weight considering her relationship with the defendant?
Well, you know, this is a either-or question, because on the one hand, she did provide very damning testimony simply by saying, yes, that was me on the video carrying out evidence from my house, and Aaron Hernandez told me to get rid of it. That's pretty damning because she did that after the murder, and she conveniently didn't remember where she put that very big bag of trash, though she remembered it was a dumpster, but has no idea of where she went, as if she goes every day to a dumpster and just can't remember because she does it all the time. Makes no sense. So on the one hand, it was very damning, but she had no choice but to acknowledge that that is what she did because it was on tape. That's what makes this case so strong. Much of it is on tape. On the other hand, she tried to say, you know, I asked him if he did it and he said he was innocent. And, you know, in a sense, she was able to be his voice and tell the jury he's innocent because she talked to him. And so she's able to speak for him. He's obviously not, he has not taken the stand, nor would he. So she gave him that voice, that opportunity to speak for him and say he didn't do it. But on that score, then the jury's going to say, but you're his fiance, you're the mother of his child. Of course you're going to get up there and speak up for him. It's sort of like asking the mother of a killer, do you believe in your son's innocence? What mother on earth would say, no, not me, I think he did it? So, you know, she had some moments that were good for the defense, but they weren't that credible. And she had some moments that were good for the prosecution, and they were very credible because they were on tape.
And what about the fact that she said that the box, which she did not look in, smelled like marijuana? What significance does that have? Does that help the defense?
Well, that's an interesting moment in the case that I'm not sure quite what the jury will make of it, because she hadn't ever before. She'd spoken to many investigators in the past and prosecutors, and she hadn't ever said before that she smelled skunky material, which everyone understands to mean she smelled pot in the bag. On the one hand, it offers up a plausible explanation for why she was getting rid of it. Marijuana is illegal, after all. Actually, in Massachusetts, if you have a license, you know, whatever you call it, permission to buy it, it's not illegal. But saying she smelled it was, I think, a desperate attempt to say, yes, I was getting rid of something at Hernandez's request, but it wasn't murder evidence. It was just that he was a pothead and I was getting rid of the pot, because you can get in trouble for smoking pot. I think the fact is, when you're under investigation or you're a suspect in a murder case, you don't give a damn if you have pot in your basement. You're not looking to cover up pot.
Right.
You are, however, looking to get rid of the weapon, and putting two and two together, the jury is going to use common sense to say the gun was there, then it's gone. She carried a bag out. We don't think it was pot.
Right. Gives her a reason, at least, to be throwing away this box. A lot of talk has been about the shoes that Hernandez may or may not have been wearing. They're Air Jordans. Why are these shoes so important to the prosecution's case?
Yeah, these are a bit like the Bruno Mali shoes in the O.J. Simpson trial. You're probably too young to remember that. But, when you have a unique foot wearing a unique shoe, and the prints from that unique shoe that matches up your unique foot are at the crime scene, it's critically important evidence, even though, as the defense pointed out, it may be rare, but it's not a 1 in a million. It's not one of a kind. And that's important, because then it could have been anybody else's shoe who just happened to be in that area. But why it matters is those shoe prints were outside the car at the murder scene. And if the defense has any theory here that the jury might buy into, it's not that Hernandez wasn't there or that, he wasn't involved at some level. He obviously was. They can't avoid that evidence. It's who got out of the car and pulled the trigger. And there's a lot of DNA and forensic proof that it was Hernandez, but it's not overwhelming. And the shoe print is part of that forensic proof. They're saying, obviously, Hernandez got out of the car because his prints from his shoe are at the murder scene where the body was found. And those shoe prints don't match either of the other two guys who were there.
So when do you...
But the defense argument is, still doesn't prove he killed him, and other people have that unusual shoe size. I still think the jury's going to say, well, they weren't walking around there on that night, and there's no evidence that a guy with big feet like that wearing those special shoes was there at the time of the crime. Common sense, put two and two together. Those were Hernandez's feet, which means he got out of the car, which means he was probably the trigger man. Again, though, the prosecution doesn't have to prove that he was the trigger man. So it really isn't that important to the case, but it adds a lot to the argument that the defense claim that Hernandez was just there and didn't know it was going to be a murder doesn't make sense, because if that were true, Hernandez would not have gotten out of the car.
Okay. And, despite the fact that a lot of what we're talking about sounds like circumstantial evidence, it's pretty clear you believe the prosecution has satisfied its burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the charges against Hernandez. But, we were speaking earlier, you said there is something, though, that you think may influence the jury and the conclusion that they come to based upon how much information they were presented with. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I do think that sometimes a prosecutor can put on just too much evidence. And when you do that, you give jurors opportunities to say, well, that wasn't as strong as that. And, although I believe the first 400 pieces of evidence, when you got to 450, I started to think, oh, that's not really as strong as the first 12 pieces. You don't want jurors to subconsciously start to compare and contrast the weight they're according the various pieces of evidence. That's what I think is problematic about overdoing it. Objectively, this case is as close to a videotape of the crime as any case I've ever seen. It is a rock-solid, slam dunk, beyond all doubt kind of case. That's how I feel. However, it's Aaron Hernandez, and he was making $40 million, and had no reason to want to go away for the rest of his life. Who would ever give up $40 million to kill some guy? It makes no sense. If you're that rich, pay somebody to do it. This is what jurors are going to be thinking. That makes no sense that he would do it himself if he's that rich, right? Here's the problem with that theme. When you're that rich and you're that powerful and you think you're above the law, and he apparently did, because remember, there's allegation that he committed another crime of serious consequence that he got away with, if indeed he did it, and that he shot another guy in the face, and he's never been held accountable. If you're that kind of guy where you think you're so rich and so powerful, you think you can pull the trigger and never get in trouble. And the jury may well think to itself, yeah, it makes no sense to give up $40 million, but if you don't think you're going to have to give it up, you might just do the crime.
And just really quickly, Wendy, a lot of people here and who've been following the trial pretty closely say the evidence is largely circumstantial against Aaron Hernandez. And, some people hear this and think, how then is it so cut and dry? How, did the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt his guilt? Can you sort of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as I said, I think it's been proved beyond all doubt. I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that he is guilty. And I say that as objectively as I can, but for a very simple reason. Unlike a lot of murder cases where they happen in isolation and no one knows who was there or exactly what went down, Here we know 100% that it was only 3 guys who could have done it. Only 3. No one disputes that. It was one of these 3 guys, Aaron Hernandez, or 2 of his co-conspirators who have yet to face their own trials on these same charges. When only one of 3 people could have done the crime, and the prosecution argues that they all 3 did it together, and you really can't prove otherwise, because you're the defense looking at this mountain of evidence saying, you know, there is no dispute. There is no way to dispute the fact that these 3 people were at the murder scene and this man died while those 3 guys were with him. That's a really hard case to defend, no matter what your evidence. Because what are you going to say? Oh, it was one of the other guys who did it. Okay, but we're arguing joint venture theory, which means even if it was one of the other guys, you, Aaron Hernandez, are on the hook too, so long as we can prove that you were part of the deal. You were in agreement with them to do the crime. You know, you don't have to prove too much to prove that they did it on purpose together and with a plan, because they're together beforehand, they're together after the fact, and Aaron Hernandez himself cannot dispute the evidence that proves he tried to cover up the crime and he lied about it. I don't know what more the prosecutor would want. I've racked my brain on this and thought, what more would the prosecution have wanted to have as evidence in this case to feel perfectly confident that their case was rock solid? I can't think of a thing.
All right, Wendy Murphy with us from Boston. We appreciate your insight, and we shall see what happens. Thank you so much. You can keep up with this story in real time by downloading the ABC News app and storing the story for exclusive updates on the go. I'm Carolyn Costello in New York.